I never expected that a quiet afternoon at the market would change my family forever. A frail vendor suddenly grabbed my wrist and whispered a secret about my sons-in-laws that sent chills down my spine. At first I thought it was nonsense, but what I saw moments later with my own eyes made me question everything I believed. Hidden behind the stalls, I began to witness a trail of lies, luxury, and betrayal that threatened to destroy the very foundation of my son's life. This story is not just about money, but about deception, trust, and the courage to face the truth no matter how painful it is. If you find meaning in this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Now let me take you back to the moment when it all began. The sun hung low over the coastal town, painting the streets in a muted glow of orange and gold. Saturday was always the busiest day at the market when fishermen shouted the prices of their fresh catch. Children darted between stalls, clutching pieces of warm bread, and vendors bartered with customers over ripe tomatoes or bolts of the fabric. It was a familiar chaos, one that Eleanor Grayson found both comforting and exhausting. At 65, she preferred quiet corners, yet she still came to the market every week, determined to cling to the rhythms of life that had carried her through decades of solitude. Her son Daniel had parked their car on the edge of the square and offered to come with her, but she waved him off with a smile. She wanted a moment alone, just to buy a loaf of bread and a few vegetables. It was a small ritual she refused to give up, even though she often counted her coins twice before making a purchase. Eleanor stood in line at a bakery stall, admiring the golden loaves stacked high like bricks of sunshine. She handed over her bills, expecting nothing more than the usual polite nod from the vendor. But as he passed her change, the man's hand lingered on hers. His grip tightened, suddenly startling her. She looked up. The vendor was older, his face weathered by years of salt air and hard labor, yet his eyes burned with an intensity that froze her in place. Leaning across the counter, his voice dropped to a rasping whisper. "You are Daniel's mother, aren't you?" The question made her chest tighten. "Yes." "Why?" His fingers dug into her wrist just slightly enough to make her aware of the urgency in his voice. "You need to open your eyes. His wife's family, the Hales, they are not what they pretend to be. Watch them closely and you will see." Eleanor blinked, stunned by the words. "What are you talking about?" she managed to whisper back. But the man's expression shifted as quickly as it had hardened. He released her hand, straightened his shoulders, and resumed bagging loaves as though nothing had happened. The next customer stepped forward oblivious, and Eleanor was left clutching her bread with trembling fingers. She tried to shake off the unease, telling herself it was nonsense, perhaps the rambling of a tired old man. Yet the look in his eyes lingered in her mind like the aftertaste of something bitter. She walked away from the stall, her heart thudding. Daniel would be waiting for her in the car. She should head straight back, but her steps slowed as she approached the edge of the market. The words replayed in her head. "Not what they pretend to be. Watch them closely." She stopped near a row of fabric stalls where colorful cloth fluttered like flags in the evening breeze. Behind them, half hidden from the crowd, stood a narrow passage that led to the back of the market. Eleanor slipped inside her loaf of bread pressed tightly against her chest. The passage smelled of damp stone and salt air from the sea. At its end, she found a shadowed alcove between two storage sheds stacked high with crates. From there, she could see the main square without being seen herself. She felt foolish for hiding, but something stronger than reason kept her rooted. Curiosity, fear, a mother's instinct that had guided her through the hardest years of her life. It happened faster than she expected. Barely 2 minutes passed before a tall figure emerged from the crowd. Victor Hale, her daughter-in-law Celeste's father. He walked with the calm confidence of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. In his arms were glossy shopping bags emblazoned with the name of a boutique Eleanor had only glimpsed in passing, the kind of place where the price of a scarf equaled her entire monthly grocery budget. She felt her breath catch. The Hales had told Daniel countless times that they were struggling, that Victor's health was fragile, that their bills were impossible to pay. She had even contributed small sums herself, scraping from her pension to help with what she believed were emergencies. But here he was, carrying luxuries as if they were nothing. Eleanor pressed deeper into the shadows, her pulse hammering. Victor crossed the square and approached a car parked not far from her hiding spot. The sight of it made her stomach twist. It was new, sleek and foreign, its pale paint gleaming like ivory under the setting sunday. The vehicle was spotless with chrome that reflected the marketplace like a mirror. He opened the trunk with a casual flick of the keys and placed the bags inside with the care of a man handling treasures. Then he pulled out a phone and began speaking in a low voice. His body language relaxed, his smile easy. Eleanor watched in silence, every detail etching itself into her memory. The polished shoes, the well-cut jacket, the smooth confidence of someone who carried no financial burden at all. She thought of Daniel working late nights, coming home with tired eyes, speaking proudly of supporting his wife's family through hard times. She thought of her own savings, the sacrifices she had made, the times she had gone without so she could offer help. And suddenly the vendor's whisper did not feel like nonsense anymore. Her throat tightened as the weight of realization pressed down. Was it possible that the Hales had been lying to them all along? That every plea, every tear-filled call from Celeste was nothing but a performance designed to drain her son's generosity dry? Victor ended his call and looked around the square. His gaze swept dangerously close to where Eleanor crouched, hidden behind the crates. For a moment she feared he would see her, that his eyes would lock with hers. But he turned back toward the crowd and began walking with unhurried steps, disappearing once more into the maze of stalls. Eleanor let out the breath she had been holding. Her hands shook as she clutched the loaf of bread. She wanted to run back to Daniel to bury the suspicion under a mountain of denial, but the seed had already been planted too deeply. The market noise buzzed in her ears. Vendors called out their prices. Children laughed. But for Eleanor, the world had narrowed to one chilling thought. The Hales were not what they pretended to be, and she was going to find out exactly what they were hiding. She straightened slowly, her legs unsteady, and took one last look at the square where Victor had vanished. Then she turned back toward the passage. Daniel would be waiting. She would smile and tell him the line had been long, that nothing unusual had happened. But deep inside she knew her life, and his had just shifted onto a path from which there was no turning back. The truth was out there, lurking just beneath the surface of this quiet coastal town. And Eleanor Grayson was about to uncover it piece by piece, no matter how dark it turned out to be. The drive home from the market should have been uneventful. The coastal road curved along the cliffs, the waves below crashing against the jagged rocks, throwing white spray into the air. Daniel hummed quietly beside her, his hands steady on the wheel, completely unaware that his mother's heart was racing with questions she could not voice. "Everything all right, Mom?" he asked casually, glancing at her pale face. Eleanor forced a smile. "Just tired." The market was crowded. He nodded, accepting her answer without suspicion. That was Daniel's nature. He trusted people easily, too easily, and it had always been both his strength and his weakness. She said nothing more, but inside her mind, Victor's image kept replaying. The boutique bags, the gleaming car, the relaxed smile of a man who had no troubles in the world. 2 days later, Eleanor had her chance to confirm what she had seen. Daniel had invited her to join him for lunch at Celeste's family home. She had hesitated at first, but curiosity and perhaps duty pulled her along. If there was truth to the vendor's warning, she needed to see it with her own eyes in the Hales world, not just through a crack between market stalls. The countryside estate came into view as they turned off the main road. Eleanor's breath caught. The last time she had visited the house had looked worn with peeling paint and sagging shutters. Now its facade gleamed as if freshly painted, the windows framed with new curtains, the lawn manicured to perfection. Even the stone pathway had been polished, glowing in the midday Sunday. "Looks like they have been busy fixing the place up," Daniel said with pride in his voice. "Celeste told me her father has been working extra hours to cover the repairs." Eleanor only nodded, though her doubts deepened. Repairs, yes. But this looked more like a costly renovation, not the handiwork of a family scraping to survive. The door swung open before they could knock. Celeste appeared radiant as ever, dressed in a flowing dress of silk-like fabric that clung to her frame with an elegance Eleanor had only seen in fashion magazines. A delicate necklace glittered against her collarbone. Her makeup was flawless, and her perfume, subtle but rich, carried a scent Eleanor recognized from high-end stores she herself had never dared enter. Eleanor Celeste exclaimed, embracing her warmly. "What a surprise, I did not know Daniel was bringing you today." "I hope it is not an inconvenience," Eleanor murmured, caught between politeness and unease. "Of course not," Celeste said brightly, stepping aside. "Come in. We were just setting the table." The moment Eleanor stepped into the living room, her suspicions tightened like a knot. The furniture was new. A leather sofa gleamed in the corner, its cushions plump and untouched by wear. A glass coffee table sparkled as if it had been polished for a showroom. On the wall hung a massive flat-screen television that had not existed the last time she visited. Her eyes darted across the room, cataloging each detail. Every item screamed money. Not desperation, not struggle money. At the dining table, crystal glasses sparkled in the light from the chandelier above. The smell of roasting meat drifted from the kitchen, mingled with the rich aroma of imported spices. Eleanor caught sight of bottles of wine on the sideboard labels she recognized from the same boutique market stall where she had seen Victor days earlier. "Do sit down," Celeste said, pulling out a chair for her. "We wanted today to be special." Eleanor lowered herself into the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Daniel beamed as he helped Celeste with dishes utterly at ease in this picture of abundance. The food that arrived was nothing short of extravagant. Platters of roasted lamb, bowls of exotic vegetables, salads sprinkled with nuts and cheese sauces that shimmered with oils Eleanor could never afford. She lifted her glass, sipping the wine, and nearly coughed when she recognized its flavor from a bottle she had once seen priced at $50. "This wine is delicious," she said carefully. "Where did you find it?" Victor entered just then, wiping his hands with a towel, dressed in casual but expensive clothes that looked freshly pressed. He smiled warmly at Eleanor. "Ah, a friend of mine deals with imports. Got us a great price. Normally we would never be able to afford it." There it was again. The perfect excuse ready at hand. Eleanor's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. She wanted to believe she truly did, but the consistency of the explanations made them feel rehearsed. As the meal unfolded, Eleanor kept her gaze moving, drinking in the evidence around her. Every object, every dish, every article of clothing contradicted the image of hardship Daniel believed so firmly. Celeste chattered about upcoming plans, a family celebration that sounded lavish, filled with decorations, food, and entertainment. When Eleanor raised her eyebrows at the cost, Celeste only laughed. "Oh, we have been saving for months. Besides, Father has taken on some consulting work. It helps." The explanation was vague, and Eleanor noted how quickly Victor changed the subject, steering the conversation back to lighter topics. But then, mid-meal, Eleanor's phone buzzed. She slid it discreetly from her pocket beneath the table. A message from an unknown number lit up the screen. Attached was a photograph, a receipt dated just 3 days earlier, the total well over $400. The items listed were luxury goods, imported seafood, fine wines, gourmet cheeses. At the bottom of the slip, clear as day, was the name of the purchaser, Victor Hales. Eleanor slipped the phone back into her pocket, her pulse quickening. The evidence was now undeniable. She looked up, her gaze drifting across the room. Daniel was laughing at something Celeste had said, his face open and unguarded. He had no idea that the very people he loved most outside of his mother were building their comfort upon his sacrifices. Eleanor pressed her lips together, swallowing the storm inside her. The whispers at the market had been real. The polished facade of the Hales was built on lies. The hardest part now would not be finding the truth. It would be showing Daniel what he refused to see. And deep in her bones, Eleanor knew this was only the beginning. The afternoon sun poured through the tall windows of the Hale estate, casting golden light across the dining room. Eleanor sat stiffly at the edge of her chair, her hands folded in her lap, as if by holding perfectly still, she could quiet the storm building inside her. She could not stop replaying the photo she had received moments earlier. The receipt burned in her mind like a brand. $400 spent without hesitation on luxuries, while her son worked himself weary to provide for them. Daniel, oblivious, was in high spirits. He poured Celeste another glass of wine, leaning close to whisper something that made her laugh. His smile was unguarded, his affection genuine. Watching him only deepened Eleanor's dread. How cruel, she thought, for lies to be wrapped so elegantly in warmth and charm. Celeste reached for Eleanor's hand across the table. "I hope you like the meal," she said sweetly. "We wanted today to feel like family." Eleanor forced her lips into a smile. It generous." "Too generous, maybe," Victor added with a chuckle, carrying another dish from the kitchen. "But when opportunities come, one must seize them." Yes, his tone was light, but his eyes flickered with something Eleanor could not quite place. It was the same gleam she had seen at the market, calculated, watchful. Conversation flowed easily for Daniel, but Eleanor listened differently now. Every story Celeste told of hardship carried an undertone that rang false. Every mention of sacrifice or struggle felt like part of a script. The rhythm of it was too smooth, too practiced, like lines recited from memory. When the plates were cleared, Celeste guided Eleanor into the sitting room. "Come," she said brightly, "you have to see the improvements we made." Eleanor's steps slowed as she entered. The room had transformed since her last visit. New curtains framed the windows. The walls bore fresh paint. A sleek bookshelf filled with glossy volumes replaced the old rickety one she remembered. On the floor lay a rug woven with intricate patterns, its fibers so fine it seemed out of place in a household that supposedly struggled to pay bills. "Lovely, isn't it?" Celeste beamed, sweeping her arm as though presenting a palace. "We have been fortunate lately. Father's consulting brings in just enough for small touches here and there. Small touches." Eleanor's gaze drifted to the large flat-screen television mounted on the wall. It gleamed like a mirror, so new that the protective film still clung to its edges. She swallowed her questions, though suspicion burned hotter. They moved through the house room by room. Each space told the same story. New furniture, polished surfaces, expensive trinkets artfully displayed. In the master bedroom, Eleanor's eyes caught on several glossy bags piled on the dresser, some still bulging with purchases. She glanced quickly at the price tags dangling from one handle and nearly gasped. A single blouse cost more than her entire month's pension. Celeste noticed her glance and laughed lightly. "Clearance sales," she said breezily. "You would be amazed what you can find if you know where to look." Eleanor pressed her lips into a thin line, unwilling to argue. But inside her thoughts screamed. No clearance sale explained jewelry tucked into boxes beneath tissue paper or the fragrance of imported perfume wafting from the vanity. They returned to the living room where Daniel and Victor were discussing sports, both relaxed, both smiling. For a moment, Eleanor wondered if she was the only one awake inside a dream everyone else insisted was real. She lowered herself into a chair, her pulse quickening. Then her phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. This time it was a photograph of a different receipt, dated barely a week ago, $600 on champagne and seafood. She slid the phone back into her pocket before anyone noticed her breath shallow. The evidence was stacking higher, each piece heavier than the last. Daniel glanced at her. "Everything all right, Mom?" Eleanor nodded quickly. "Just a bit warm in here." The conversation at the table resumed. Victor spoke about his supposed consulting work, vague descriptions that revealed nothing concrete. Celeste mentioned plans for an upcoming family celebration, hinting at extravagant decorations and catered meals. Daniel listened with admiration, proud of his wife's ability to make do with little. Eleanor nearly laughed at the irony, though the sound would have come out broken. She could see the truth now more clearly than ever yet. Daniel remained blind, wrapped in loyalty and love. As the afternoon waned, they gathered in the kitchen for tea. The counters were cluttered with expensive ingredients, exotic fruits, imported oils and cheeses Eleanor had never tasted in her life. Celeste poured tea into porcelain cups so delicate that Eleanor feared she might break one simply by holding it. "Do you take sugar?" Celeste asked sweetly. "No, thank you, Eleanor," replied her voice tight. She stirred her cup, though there was nothing to stir her mind far away. For a moment, she considered pulling out her phone, laying the receipts on the table, and demanding an explanation. But the image of Daniel's trusting face stopped her. He would defend them. He would accuse her of jealousy, of meddling. The confrontation would drive him deeper into their grip. Not yet, she told herself. She needed more. Irrefutable proof. Enough to cut through the web of excuses that had been spun so carefully around her son. When they finally left the estate, Daniel carried leftovers and bottles of wine Celeste insisted they take. He seemed happy, humming softly as they walked to the car. Eleanor carried only her silence, each step heavier than the last. As they pulled onto the road, Daniel sighed contentedly. "See, Mom, they are doing their best. Times are hard, but they manage. I am glad you came today. Now you can see for yourself." Eleanor turned to the window, hiding the sting in her eyes. She had seen for herself, yes, but what she had seen was not resilience. It was deception wrapped in charm, painted over with wealth that should not exist. The market vendor's whisper echoed in her ears once more. "Watch them closely." Eleanor clasped her hands together in her lap, steadying herself. She would watch. She would gather every thread of truth, no matter how painful. For Daniel's sake, she would see this through. Because behind the laughter, the polished floors, and the dazzling smiles, a darkness was taking root, and Eleanor Grayson was determined to tear it into the light. That night the ocean would not quiet. Waves shouldered the shoreline with a relentless patience, the sound spilling through Eleanor's cracked window like a steady heartbeat she could not slow. She sat at her small kitchen table with the light off the receipt photos glowing on her phone. Each image was a ledger of something she did not want to admit. Luxuries tallied in neat columns, sums that had cost her son sleep and pride. She had meant to sleep. She had meant to let the day settle into memory. Instead, she traced each line item with her eyes until the numbers blurred and the edges of the photos melted into a pale haze. The market vendor's whisper threaded through everything. "Watch them closely." He had sounded like he was asking for forgiveness more than giving advice. Across town, the Hale estate would be asleep under its polished roof. The rug, the chandelier, the bottles with their gold-tipped labels, the house of careful stories. Eleanor pictured Daniel there in a future he still believed in, laughing in a room that smiled back at him. The thought moved like a splinter under her skin. Her phone buzzed again. The same unknown number. Another photo loaded slowly, as though reluctant to arrive. This one was not a market receipt. It was a delivery invoice. A familiar surname printed at the top, a list of imported chocolates, pastries, and a floral arrangement large enough to sweeten a wedding. The driver's signature at the bottom looked like a flourish, proud and careless. She typed a reply before she could stop herself. "Who are you? Why are you sending me these?" The answer came minutes later. Someone who watched too long in silence. "You should have what you need." She stared at the words until the screen dimmed. A part of her wanted proof to come from clean places, official emails, witnesses with names. But the world rarely brought truth with a ribbon. It brought it in smudged screenshots and the voice of a stranger across a counter. The ocean kept pounding. She put the phone face down and let the darkness press close. In the morning, the town looked ordinary again. Fishermen hosed their decks, the bakery glass fogged with warm breath. Eleanor walked slowly, tuning herself to every small sound, as if the truth lived in the scrape of a chair or the clink of a spoon. People nodded to her as they always had, yet the simple greetings felt heavier, like each was a stone added to a basket she carried alone. She bought apples she did not want just to stand at the stall longer. She listened to two women nearby talk about a party she had not heard about. The Hale house again. Lanterns in the trees. Musicians on the back terrace. The words drifted like soap bubbles, bright and floating. One woman said, "Lucky them." The other said, "Careful money finds careful hands." They laughed and moved on, leaving their laughter behind like perfume. When she reached home, Daniel was waiting on the stoop with a plastic bag of groceries and his smile, the one that always softened the world. He rose to hug her. He smelled like work and shampoo and the garlic from the pasta he said he had made the night before. "You look tired," he said. "I am fine," she said, though the word felt like a pebble in her mouth. She took the grocery bag from him to have something to do with her hands. They sat at the table, and he talked about a project at the office and a coworker who insisted on watering dead plants. She asked him if he was eating well, and he said better than ever. He told her he would take her to the shore on Sunday. He told her the sun would help her sleep. She watched him as he spoke. The kindness in his eyes did not belong to caution, it belonged to open doors. She thought of how easy it would be to wound him with a sentence. "Daniel," she said gently, "do you ever feel like Celeste tells you stories you cannot verify?" The question hung between them, weightless and threatening. He blinked as if a small light had flashed. Then he smiled, patient and sad. "Mom," he said, "we have been through this before. There is trust and there is surveillance. I married the person I love. I cannot ask her to produce receipts for her feelings. You taught me that love without trust becomes a cage." She felt the floor tilt slightly. She wanted to say, "I am not asking you to cage anyone." She wanted to say, "I am asking you to keep the door open long enough to see whether the person inside is breaking the furniture." Instead, she placed her hand over his. It was warm and steady. "You are right," she said. "Your life must be your own." The truth of the words surprised her. They were a kind of surrender and a kind of promise both at once. He left soon after, humming again, as he walked down the steps, the grocery bag swinging from his hand. She watched him until the corner took him away. Then she closed the door softly and leaned her forehead against it. The wood was cool. The ocean behind the town breathed in and out like something asleep with one eye open. In the days that followed, Eleanor learned how to listen the way a librarian listens for a missing page. She went to the market at different hours and stood in lines she did not need so that the world would speak in front of her. She took the long way to the post office to pass the hill that let her see the Hale backyard from a distance. She told herself this was not spying, it was witnessing. Anonymous messages kept arriving, spaced like footsteps, a photograph of a bank envelope tucked into a designer handbag on a chair at a cafe, a snapshot of a new watch on Victor's wrist, the metal catching light like a wink, a copy of a reservation ledger showing a table for 8 at the expensive restaurant by the marina. Always dates, always amounts, always a neat name across the bottom. At twilight one evening, she saw a florist van idle at the edge of the estate. Workers carried boxes through the gate. From the hill, Eleanor could not see the arrangements clearly, only the sweep of color, a soft riot in the falling light. Music began, not loud, but confident, the way money speaks when it wants to sound like modesty. She lowered herself onto the curb and sat as the streetlights blinked on. A neighbor she knew from church passed and paused to chat. He mentioned that the Hales had done well lately. "Consulting," he said with a tone that meant anything and nothing. He touched the brim of his cap and walked on. She stayed until the music ended and the van left and the dark settled like a cloak. Then she walked home by the path along the sea, her shoes crunching the grit. In the distance, a lighthouse swept its measured arc across the water, a single eye refusing to tire. She thought of its steady insistence. Its job was not to drag boats to safety. Its job was only to show where the rocks waited. The thought steadied her more than she expected. The next afternoon, Daniel called. His voice held the brightness he used when he was carrying a weight he could not name. "Father-in-law may need a minor procedure," he said. "Insurance is complicated. You know how it is. We can help with a little bridge. A couple hundred, just until next week. A couple hundred," she repeated. The phrase felt like a curtain pulled over a window. Light still came in around the edges. "Only if you are comfortable," he said quickly. "We will manage. I just thought if you had a little to spare." Eleanor looked at the stack of envelopes on her table. Utility bill, pharmacy notice, a letter from a friend she missed. She slid one finger along the edge of the pharmacy notice until it bent. "Let me think," she said softly. "I will call you tonight." After they hung up, she opened her phone. She scrolled through the images until she found the delivery invoice with the date that matched the supposed bridge. $600 on champagne and seafood. The total glared up at her like a dare. Her chest hurt in a small, precise way, as if a string had been tied around her heart and pulled tight. She stood and walked to the sink and turned on the tap, letting the water run until it was cold, then cupped her hands under it and drank as if the water could rinse something clean inside her. That evening she called Daniel back and told him the truth without telling him everything. "I cannot help this time," she said. "I am not well placed for it, not this month." Her voice did not shake. She did not explain why. He was quiet, then careful, then kind. "It is all right," he said. "Do not worry. Thank you anyway." After the call ended, she sat at the table again with the lighthouse beam moving across the inner wall like a slow metronome. She took a notebook from the drawer and began to write. Dates, amounts, deliveries, parties. She wrote what she had seen and what she had been sent and what she had heard from mouths that did not know she was listening. She did not add opinions, only facts. The page filled with a neat grid of lines, a fragile bridge she hoped would carry her and her son to the other side of the story. By midnight, she had a timeline that did not bend toward accidents. It bent toward intention. She looked down at the last date and felt something settle in her chest, not relief but resolve. She understood now that truth would not politely knock. It would arrive like weather, and she would need to meet it at the door with a coat and a plan. Before bed, she sent one message to the unknown number. "Thank you. If there is more, send it." The reply was quick. "There is more. Be careful." In the mirror, she saw the calm face she had learned to wear. Behind it, a landscape of worry and steel. She thought of Daniel's first steps on a kitchen floor in a small apartment years ago, how he had looked back at her to make sure she was watching. She had been there then. She would be there now. Eleanor turned off the light and lay down. The ocean kept its patient talk. Somewhere across town, a house glowed with soft lamps and costly comforts, and the practiced grace of better stories. She closed her eyes and pictured the lighthouse again, its beams sweeping long and sure. The rocks did not move, the water did not forget, neither would she. Morning would come, and with it the choice she had been postponing. Not whether to see, but how to show. Not whether to speak, but when. And when the speaking began, she knew the words would not only test the truth, they would test the bonds that had held her family together for years. Some knots would hold, others would tear. The tide would decide the rest. For now she breathed with the sea and waited for dawn. The weight of secrets no longer felt like a burden she carried alone. It felt like a signal steady and bright sweeping the dark to show where the danger lay. Soon, very soon, she would follow that light straight into the heart of what the Hales had built. And when the beam fell on all that glittered, there would be no place left to hide. The days that followed were marked by a silence Eleanor could not share. Daniel went to work each morning with the same determined stride, his tie neatly knotted, his briefcase in hand. To him, life ticked forward as it always had. To her, every hour felt like a drumbeat pulling her deeper into a secret no one else wanted to see. The notebook she had started on her kitchen table was filling quickly. Dates and times, receipts and whispers, neighbors' gossip, and the photos from the anonymous sender, all of it captured in careful lines of her slanted handwriting. The pages looked clinical, but the weight behind them was heavy. Each new entry was another thread in a web that proved what her heart already knew: the Hales were not struggling at all. They were thriving on Daniel's sacrifices. On Wednesday evening, just as the sun dipped low and painted the town in amber, another message appeared on her phone. A photo slid across the screen: Victor standing outside a jewelry shop, handing over a thick wad of cash in exchange for a small velvet box. The timestamp was from that afternoon. Beneath it, a single line of text: "Your son is paying for this too." Eleanor set the phone down slowly, her pulse climbing. She pictured Daniel bent over his desk working through overtime shifts, believing his extra paychecks were saving a family from collapse. Meanwhile, Victor was strolling out of jewelry stores with boxes worth more than Eleanor's monthly rent. The rage that rose inside her felt unfamiliar. She had known anger before, but this was different, sharper, colder, something that pressed her toward action. Still, she kept her silence. Proof was building, but Daniel's trust in Celeste was a fortress. To bring it down, she would need evidence so heavy it crushed denial. The following Sunday, Eleanor took the long route home from church. She lingered near the edge of the Hale neighborhood where trimmed hedges framed wide driveways. From her vantage point on the opposite sidewalk, she had a clear view of their house. Music drifted faintly through the air. Not a radio, not something casual. This was live, a trio of musicians set up under white canopies in the backyard. Waiters moved among guests carrying trays of champagne. Through the fence slats, Eleanor caught glimpses of dresses shimmering under the afternoon sun and the glint of cutlery laid on tables dressed in linen. It wasn't hardship she was seeing. It was a celebration that cost more in one afternoon than she and Daniel spent in months. A voice startled her. "Quite the show, isn't it?" Eleanor turned to see a woman about her age pulling a cart of groceries up the sidewalk. She recognized her vaguely, one of the Hale neighbors. The woman shook her head. "They've been hosting parties like this all season. You wouldn't know it from the stories they tell, though, always going on about bills and struggles. Her eyes flicked knowingly toward Eleanor. I suppose it's easier to take pity when you don't live on the same street. Eleanor managed a polite nod, though her heart raced. Even the neighbors knew. The Hales' reputation was a facade, and everyone who lived close enough could see the cracks. Only Daniel was kept blind, his kindness weaponized against him. By evening, the music had quieted, the guests drifted away, and Eleanor returned home. She added another entry to her notebook, her pen pressing deeper into the paper than before. The weight of secrets was no longer abstract. It was a ledger with numbers and names, and the evidence was piling too high to ignore. 2 days later, the breaking point arrived. Daniel knocked on her apartment door, looking more worn than she had ever seen him. His tie hung loose, his eyes shadowed. "Mom," he said, sinking into a chair, "I need to borrow $200, just until Friday." Her chest tightened. "Why, Daniel?" "It's for Celeste's father. Another medical expense. Insurance is covering some, but not all. He needs a procedure." His voice cracked slightly. "I've been working doubles, but I'm still short." Eleanor stared at him, her son, who had always been so careful with money, who never asked her for help unless desperation pushed him to it. She thought of the jewelry box, the champagne, the laughter spilling from behind the Hales fence. She folded her hands slowly, steadying her voice. "Daniel, before I give you anything, I need you to see something." From the drawer, she pulled her notebook and laid it on the table, page after page filled with dates, photos, descriptions. She turned it toward him, her hands trembling slightly. At first, Daniel only frowned. Then his eyes scanned the receipts, the photos of Victor's car, the invoices with his father-in-law's name. His face paled. "Where did you get this?" Eleanor explained everything. The vendor at the market, the anonymous texts, the parties, the jewelry, the whispers of neighbors who had seen more than they should have. Her voice was quiet but steady, her words measured so they wouldn't sound like accusation, only truth. Daniel leaned back slowly, his eyes fixed on the photographs. "No," he said at first, his tone brittle. "There has to be an explanation." But even as he spoke, doubt crept across his expression. He turned another page, then another, each one cut deeper. His hand rose to his forehead, his breath shallow. "Mom," he whispered, "if this is true, if they've been lying all this time." He couldn't finish the sentence. Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand. I didn't want to believe it either. "But denial won't protect you, Daniel. Look at the facts. They are using you." Silence stretched between them. The only sound was the clock ticking on the wall, marking each second as Daniel's trust began to unravel. Finally, he closed the notebook, his hand resting heavily on the cover. His eyes, when they lifted to hers, were filled with both pain and resolve. "I need to see for myself," he said. Eleanor nodded, though fear pressed coldly against her ribs. He would see, and once he did, there would be no turning back. That night, as Daniel left her apartment with the notebook under his arm, Eleanor stood at the window watching him disappear into the dark. The ocean wind rattled the panes, carrying with it the taste of salt and change. The truth had been uncovered in shadows. Soon it would be forced into the light, and when it was nothing, not love, not loyalty, not even marriage, would remain untouched. Daniel arrived at Eleanor's apartment late the following evening. His face was pale, his jaw tight, and in his hand he carried the notebook she had given him. He didn't bother with pleasantries, didn't even sit down at first. He stood in the doorway like a man who had crossed a battlefield and was still hearing the echoes of gunfire. "I went through her things," he said flatly. Eleanor felt her chest tighten, and his eyes flicked to hers, and she saw in them both devastation and fury. "You were right, Mom, about everything." He finally sat, laying the notebook on the table between them. His hands trembled as he rubbed at his face. "I never wanted to believe it, but I found more than I could handle. Bags from expensive boutiques hidden in the closet, jewelry still in boxes, receipts for restaurants I could never afford. And then, the ledger." Her breath caught. "Ledger," Daniel nodded, his voice breaking. "A notebook of her own, not unlike yours. She had written down every lie she told me, every emergency, every excuse. Next to each one, she recorded how much money she got out of me. Like it was a business transaction. Like I was nothing more than a paycheck. Eleanor's stomach dropped. Even after everything she had already suspected, the coldness of it made her shiver. That's not all, Daniel continued. She had notes about future plans. More stories she was going to use sick relatives, surprise expenses, even a made-up dental surgery. She wrote reminders to herself. Guilt works, tears work better. It was all there, Mom. Every manipulation spelled out in her handwriting. Eleanor pressed a hand to her chest. She had prepared herself for lies, for excess, for denial, but not for such systematic cruelty. Not for the proof that Celeste had been treating her son's trust as a game with strategies and scorekeeping. "What did you do?" she whispered. "I confronted her," Daniel said. His voice dropped lower, heavy with the memory. At first she denied everything. She said the shopping bags were gifts, that the notebook was for budgeting. But when I showed her your photos, when I held up the receipts, she changed. He stared at the table, his hands clenching into fists. She screamed at me, said I had no right to go through her things. That you had poisoned me against her, that I'd destroyed the marriage with my paranoia. She blamed you for everything. Eleanor closed her eyes. She had expected to be painted as the villain, but the sting of it still cut deep. Daniel looked up again, his gaze sharp. And then when I wouldn't back down, she admitted it. She said it plainly, that her family never needed the money, that they saw me as easy, that it was my responsibility to share because I had a job and a mother with a pension. She called it strategy. His voice cracked. She didn't even call it love. For a moment, silence pressed down on them both. Outside, the wind rattled the branches against the window, filling the room with a hollow, rustling sound. Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand. His skin was clammy, but his grip was strong, as if holding on to her was the only thing keeping him steady. "You didn't deserve this, Daniel," she said softly. "None of it. You gave them your trust, your hard work, your love. And they turned it into a weapon." Tears glistened in his eyes. He tried to blink them away, but one slipped down his cheek. "How could I not see it, Mom? For 2 years I believed every word. I worked myself sick while they were living like kings. How could I have been so blind?" Eleanor shook her head. "Don't mistake trust for weakness. Trust is a gift. The shame belongs to those who exploit it, not to you." Daniel exhaled a trembling breath, leaning back in his chair. "I called her father, too. I wanted to hear his side. He didn't even bother pretending. He told me I'd been chosen because I was steady, dependable. He said it wasn't personal, it was business." The words seemed to hang in the air, poisonous. Eleanor's stomach turned. "Business," she repeated bitterly. "As if you were a contract instead of a son-in-law. As if marriage was just a transaction." Daniel's voice hardened. Celeste was furious when he said that. Not because he exposed the truth, but because he ruined her chance to keep going. She was angry that the game was over, not that she had betrayed me. Eleanor felt both sorrow and pride swell inside her. Her son had been broken, yes, but he was also seeing clearly for the first time. His denial had crumbled, leaving behind something stronger, though still raw. "What will you do now?" she asked gently. Daniel's eyes sharpened, his decision already forged. "I told her the marriage is over. There's no way back from this. Tomorrow I'll speak to a lawyer. I'll file for divorce." A long silence followed, filled only by the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. Eleanor's heart ached for the boy she had raised, for the man who had believed in love so completely, and for the pain he now carried. Yet beneath the sorrow was relief. Relief that the deception had finally been dragged into the light, that her son could finally begin to free himself. Daniel rose from the chair, his shoulders heavy but his eyes steady. "Thank you, Mom," he said quietly. "If you hadn't shown me the truth, I'd still be in the dark. I don't know how much more they would have taken from me." Eleanor stood too, pulling him into an embrace. He held her tightly, his frame trembling against hers. She whispered into his ear, "The worst is behind you now. The truth hurts, but it also frees." When he left, that night notebook clutched under his arm, Eleanor stood at the window long after his figure disappeared into the shadows. The air outside was sharp with salt from the sea. Somewhere beyond the waves, a lighthouse turned its steady beam, sweeping across the dark. The revelation had come at last, but revelations were only beginnings. Ahead lay the real test, the confrontation with consequences, the unraveling of promises, the reshaping of a life built on illusions. For Daniel, the storm was only beginning, and Eleanor, though fearful, knew she would face it with him every step of the way. The next day dawned gray, the kind of morning where the sea fog crept into the streets and swallowed everything in its path. Eleanor watched from her window as the mist rolled over the rooftops, blurring the edges of the town she thought she knew. It seemed fitting. Nothing looked the same anymore, not after the truth Daniel had uncovered the night before. Her phone buzzed mid-morning. It was Daniel. His voice was clipped steadier than she expected. "I'm going to confront them tonight," he said. "I need you to be ready. They'll blame you. They already do." Eleanor's hand tightened around the phone. "I'm not afraid of their blame. Just be careful, son. They're cornered now, and cornered people lash out." By evening, the fog had lifted, replaced by a cold clarity that seemed to strip the world bare. Daniel picked her up, his face pale but resolute. He drove in silence, the tires humming on the pavement, until the Hale estate rose ahead of them, looming against the fading light. The front door opened before they could knock. Celeste stood framed in the doorway, her face arranged into a mask of fury barely contained. "You went through my things," she spat, her voice sharp enough to cut the air. "You violated my trust, Daniel." Daniel's jaw tightened. "What trust?" "The trust you used as currency to fund your lies." Celeste's eyes flicked to Eleanor, brimming with venom. "This is her fault. She's poisoned you against me since the day we met, always judging, always meddling." Eleanor met her gaze calmly. "I didn't poison him. You did with your greed." The words struck like stones, but Celeste did not flinch. She smiled instead, a brittle, dangerous smile. "You think you've won something, Eleanor. You think dragging my husband here will save him. You've destroyed your son's marriage. That will be your legacy." From the hallway, Victor appeared, adjusting the cuff of his expensive jacket. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was smooth, almost bored. "Daniel, why don't we skip the theatrics? You've had your eyes opened, fine, but don't pretend you didn't benefit. You had a beautiful wife, a respected family. All we asked was a little support. Call it investment." Daniel turned to his father-in-law, his hands curling into fists. "Investment you stole from me. You stole from my mother. You bled us dry while laughing behind our backs." Victor shrugged. "We didn't force you. You gave willingly. That's on you." The casual cruelty in his tone sent heat flooding Eleanor's chest. "No," she said sharply, stepping forward. "It's on you. You saw kindness and turned it into profit. You saw love and treated it like leverage. Don't you dare call that an investment." Victor's smile cracked then, just slightly, the mask slipping. "What do you want, Daniel? An apology?" "Fine. I'm sorry. Sorry you didn't see sooner that life is survival. We do what we must." Daniel's voice rose, trembling with rage. "No, you do what you choose, and you chose to use me, to use my mother. You've destroyed every ounce of respect I ever had for you." Celeste stepped closer, her eyes glinting with desperation now. "Daniel, think about what you're doing. Divorce will ruin us both. We can fix this. We'll stop asking for money. We'll start fresh." "Stop," Daniel laughed bitterly. "You kept a ledger, Celeste. You documented every lie as if you were proud of them. You planned new ones. You never intended to stop." Her mask shattered then. The sweet, smiling wife gave way to something raw and sharp. "And so what if I did? You were easy. You believed everything I said. You wanted to be the hero. Don't blame me for playing the role you handed me." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel's chest rose and fell quickly, his face pale with shock at her admission. Eleanor felt the words cut her too, but in their cruelty there was also clarity. The masks were gone. Nothing but the truth remained. Daniel drew in a long breath, his voice low but steady. "It's over. I'll be filing tomorrow. You won't get another cent from me. Not one." Victor's eyes narrowed, but he did not protest. Perhaps he knew the performance was over. Perhaps he was already calculating his next move, his next mark. Celeste's eyes darted between them, searching for some thread to pull, some weakness left to exploit. But there was none. Her face hardened, lips curling in contempt. "Fine. Leave then. You'll regret this, Daniel." One day you'll see you threw away the best thing that ever happened to you." Daniel stepped back toward the door, his voice calm in its finality. "The best thing I ever had is standing right beside me. And you tried to tear her down too. You failed." Eleanor felt a lump rise in her throat, pride and sorrow woven together. They turned and walked out, the night air rushing around them like freedom. The door slammed behind them, the sound echoing like the end of an era. In the car, Daniel gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "It's really over," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "Yes," Eleanor said softly. "And thank God it is. Lies can only wear masks for so long. Now you've seen what's underneath." They drove away in silence, leaving behind the house of illusions. Ahead lay pain, paperwork, and long nights of doubt, but also at last the possibility of truth. As the headlights carved a path through the darkness, Eleanor reached across and touched her son's arm. "You're free now," she said. "It will hurt, but freedom always comes with pain, and it's worth it." Daniel nodded, his eyes on the road. "I know, Mom. I just never imagined the people I loved most would turn out to be strangers in masks." Eleanor leaned back, the fog curling once again across the coastal road. The masks had fallen, and though the wreckage was painful, she knew it was better than living forever in a house of lies. The Hale estate disappeared behind them, swallowed by fog and distance. Yet, even as the house faded from view, the weight of its revelations lingered like smoke. Daniel drove in silence, his knuckles pale against the steering wheel. Eleanor sat beside him, hands clasped in her lap, resisting the urge to reach for him again. She knew the storm inside him was too raw for words. Back at her apartment, he parked without cutting the engine. The low hum filled the quiet like a heartbeat. Finally, Daniel exhaled a shuddering breath. "It feels like I've been living in someone else's life, a play." And tonight, the curtains finally fell. Eleanor studied his face in the dim glow of the dashboard. The man beside her was her son, yet older, somehow altered in the span of a few nights. Pain etched itself into his features, but so did something new resolve. "Play's end," she said softly. "Real life begins after the applause fades." He gave her a weary smile, then shut off the engine. The days that followed were heavy, each one dragging its feet. Daniel moved into a small rental near his office, its walls bare, its furniture mismatched. He didn't mind. It was space untouched by lies. He filled it slowly with essentials: a kettle, a second-hand couch shelves for his books. The silence inside was both balm and torment. At night he often called Eleanor. Sometimes they spoke about ordinary things: her garden, his work, a new bakery opening by the pier. Other times his voice cracked under the weight of betrayal. "How could I have loved someone so much," he asked one evening, "and not have known her at all?" Eleanor listened. She didn't try to patch the wound with quick comfort. She knew grief needed air to breathe. When she did speak, her words were steady. "You knew the version she showed you. That's not a failure on your part, Daniel. It's a reflection of how well she wore her mask. Don't confuse her deception with your blindness." Silence followed, then a quiet, "Thanks, Mom." The divorce process began quickly, though it unfolded like a slow unraveling. Papers served, assets listed, lies laid bare in legal language. Daniel's lawyer uncovered hidden accounts. Celeste had stashed away money siphoned from his paychecks, savings disguised as emergencies. The total loss was staggering, well over $20,000. Eleanor saw the number in black ink and felt the air leave her lungs. That sum represented years of her son's labor months, of late nights, mornings, when he dragged himself from bed after barely sleeping. But Daniel only shook his head. "It's gone," he said quietly. "What matters is they can't take another dollar." Still, the betrayal cut deep. At night, he sometimes dreamed of Celeste, her voice soft, her smile bright, telling him she loved him. He woke with a start, realizing those words had been nothing more than lines rehearsed for effect. The emptiness that followed felt worse than anger. Eleanor, too, had her confrontations. Victor called one afternoon, his voice slick with desperation. "Eleanor," he said, "we went too far. But surely we can make amends. Convince Daniel to be reasonable. We'll pay him back piece by piece." She let him finish before answering, her tone sharp as steel. "You had years to be honest. You chose lies instead. Whatever you've lost, you earned." Don't call this house again." She hung up before he could reply. Her hands shook, but her chest felt lighter. For the first time, she had slammed the door firmly on their manipulations. Celeste made her attempt weeks later, arriving at Eleanor's door dressed plainly, her face scrubbed of makeup tears glittering in her eyes. "I really did love him," she whispered. "It got out of control, but I never meant to hurt him." Eleanor studied her carefully. She had seen this performance before, the soft voice, the rehearsed regret, but her heart was no longer vulnerable. "Love doesn't catalog lies in a ledger," Eleanor said quietly. "Love doesn't drain the people it claims to cherish. Whatever you felt, it wasn't love." Celeste's eyes hardened at that, the mask, slipping just enough to reveal the bitterness beneath. "He'll regret leaving me," she hissed. Perhaps Eleanor replied calmly, but better to regret leaving a liar than regret staying with one. Celeste left without another word. Eleanor never saw her again. Healing came slowly, not in sweeping moments, but in small, steady steps. Daniel began jogging in the mornings, his breath visible in the coastal air. He cooked simple meals in his new kitchen soups, pastas, dishes that filled the apartment with warmth. He opened a savings account, something he hadn't been able to do in years, and watched with quiet pride as the balance began to grow. One evening, sitting across from Eleanor at her kitchen table, he held her gaze. "I thought generosity was supposed to be a strength, but I feel like it ruined me." She shook her head. "Generosity is still a strength. You gave freely, and that's something to be proud of. What you've learned now is that generosity must walk hand in hand with wisdom. Otherwise, it becomes a gift for the wrong hands." He nodded slowly, her words settling like stones in a foundation he was rebuilding. Months passed. The seasons shifted. The final papers arrived, the divorce sealed with signatures that marked both an ending and a beginning. Daniel didn't celebrate. He only placed the folder in a drawer and exhaled as though setting down a weight he had carried for too long. The town seemed different to Eleanor, too. When she passed the market, she no longer saw just stalls and vendors. She saw the place where everything began, the whispered warning that had cracked open the truth. She often wondered what might have happened had she ignored it, had she walked away without listening. But she hadn't. She had listened. And though the path since then had been painful, it had also saved her son. One Sunday, Daniel arrived at her apartment with a bag of groceries and a smile she hadn't seen in months. He unpacked fresh vegetables, good bread, even a small cake. "I thought we'd cook together," he said. As they worked side by side in her kitchen, the silence between them felt different now, not heavy but peaceful. He told her about new projects at work, about colleagues who respected him, about the future he was beginning to imagine again. When they finally sat down to eat, Daniel lifted his glass. His voice was steady. "To truth," he said. Eleanor raised her glass, her eyes shining. "To truth," she echoed. They clinked glasses, the sound bright and clean. Outside, the waves crashed steadily against the shore, not threatening now but reassuring. A rhythm as old as time, promising that even after storms, the tide always recedes, leaving room for new beginnings. Eleanor looked at her son across the table, no longer weighed down by masks or lies. For the first time in years, she felt the future was wide open, ready to be written with honesty and strength. The pieces were scattered, yes, but together they were already picking them up. Spring arrived quietly, as if the town was afraid to jolt anyone awake from hard winters inside their own lives. Salt winds softened. The gulls called less like warnings and more like ordinary conversation. At dawn, the lighthouse still swept its patient beam across water that had learned to glimmer again. Eleanor rose early to watch the light fade into morning. It struck her that some lights are meant for the night, and others only reveal themselves when the darkness has gone. Daniel kept showing up on Sundays. Sometimes with lemons and herbs for roasted chicken, sometimes with a cheap bouquet that brightened her small table, sometimes with nothing but stories that did not hurt to tell. He jogged along the promenade now without counting his steps like penance. He cooked because it pleased him, not because a ledger demanded proof of his usefulness. Little by little, his voice lost that small tremor it had carried for months. The quiet inside him was no longer an empty room. It was a cleared space. He did not hurry toward anything. That was new. He did not fling trust like a rope into the first pair of open hands. He measured. He asked questions. He learned to let silence do some of the work. It surprised him how many truths arrive when you do not rush to fill the air. Eleanor noticed other changes, too. He had learned to leave his phone face down while they ate, to laugh at mistakes without apology, to say no to obligations that used to claim him as if he had no say. She saw it each time he rose to wash the dishes, without being asked, each time he paused at the window, like someone memorizing a landscape he had nearly lost. It happened on a Tuesday, the way turning points often do without trumpets. Daniel called near noon. His voice carried a softness she had not heard in a long time. "I met someone," he said. Eleanor let the words settle. She did not rush to bless or warn them. She only breathed. "Tell me." "Her name is Clara," he said. "We met at the office, not in my department. She handles supplier accounts across the hall. We started with coffee because of a spreadsheet that would not behave. We kept talking after the spreadsheet did." Eleanor smiled into the phone. Spreadsheets could be stubborn angels. Perhaps some miracles preferred fluorescent lights and poor coffee. "What do you like about her?" she asked. "She is steady," he said after a thoughtful pause. "Calm in a way that does not feel like a performance. She is kind without promising anything. When she does not know something, she says it. When she is wrong, she says that too. I keep waiting for the switch to flip and reveal the stage, but there is no stage. Just a person." That night he brought Clara to dinner. She arrived with a paper bag of ingredients and an easy grace that did not ask to be admired. Hair gathered in a loose knot. A cardigan with a missing button she promised to fix one day. She shook Eleanor's hand like someone who understood hands do more than wave. Her eyes held their own light. "I brought the good tomatoes," Clara said, laughing. "Which only means I did not buy them at the gas station." In the kitchen, Eleanor handed her a knife and watched how she moved. No hurry, no show. Clara chopped, rinsed, wiped the counter. When she did not know where something belonged, she asked. When she spilled a little olive oil, she did not apologize to the ceiling. She just cleaned it up. They spoke of ordinary things first. Rain that never fully arrived. A bookstore that closed too early. A stray cat who had decided the bakery steps were hers. Later, over pasta that tasted like a simple mercy, Clara said, "I do not want anything from you that you do not wish to give. I do not want to fix you. I do not want to be your test either. I just want to see who we are when we are not pretending." Eleanor felt the knot in her chest loosen by a quiet degree. She glanced at Daniel, and the look they shared was not relief exactly. It was recognition. Something in both of them had to trust the smallness of good things again. Weeks turned into a season. They walked the pier in early evenings and learned each other in sentences that did not need to be grand. Clara had a brother who built wooden boats slowly on purpose. She loved lemon cake more than chocolate. She kept a notebook of recipes and a smaller notebook of questions. She told Daniel she did not believe in perfect, but believed deeply in durable. He told her about the ledger, but not on the first night or the 10th. When he did not dramatize it. He placed the past down like a heavy coat you only take off when you are sure the room is warm enough. Clara listened without flinching and said, "I am sorry that happened to you. I am not afraid of where you have been. I am only concerned with how we walk from here." Eleanor watched this unfolding the way you watch weather in a new climate. You notice the wind more than the map. You pay attention to the sky. And always the lighthouse cutting its measured arc at the edge of vision, reminding you that light is work, not decoration. One Sunday, Clara stayed late after dinner to help with the dishes. The window above the sink framed the last bright streaks of daylight. Clara rinsed the plates while Eleanor dried. The rhythm of it felt woven, not forced. "I wanted to say thank you," Clara said quietly, "for raising a man who knows how to stop and consider, for showing him that care and caution can live in the same house." Eleanor met her eyes. "You are kind to say so." Some lessons arrived late. "Late is still on time," Clara said. Then she smiled. "Besides, he taught me something too. That tenderness can be strong and still be tenderness." When Daniel walked Clara to the car, the evening's cool salt air followed them across the small lot. Eleanor stayed at the window and did not pretend not to look. Clara rested her palms lightly against Daniel's chest as they spoke, not claiming, not pleading, just present. They hugged brief and certain. After the taillights disappeared, Daniel returned with that same quiet on his face that had begun to look like peace. "She likes lemon cake," Eleanor said. He laughed. "She really does. Make one next week," she said. "And tell her the missing button is safe here. We keep good things until they are ready." They did make the cake. Not perfect. A little sunk in the middle where the oven ran hot. They ate it anyway with strawberries and the kind of joking that only comes when fear has loosened its grip. Later, while washing the sticky bowls, Daniel said, "I think I am ready to visit the market again." They went the next morning. The same stalls, the same shouted prices. The air full of fish and dough and loud bargaining that sounded like affection. Eleanor felt a thread pull tight in her chest as they neared the bakery. The vendor who had once gripped her wrist was there stacking warm loaves in a tidy wall. He looked up and recognition sparked in his weathered face. For a heartbeat, grief flashed through Eleanor for the woman who had stood here trembling. Then she stepped forward with something like gratitude and placed coins on the counter. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded once, a serious gesture that meant he remembered, and also that he would not say more than was needed. He slipped an extra roll into the bag and pushed it toward her. "For the walk home," he said. They left the market and crossed the square. Sun pooled in the stones where the morning had warmed them. Daniel broke the extra roll and handed half to his mother. It tasted like the first day after a storm when every smell returns. Months later, on a bright afternoon that felt impossible to spend indoors, Daniel asked Clara to marry him on the bluff above the sea. No grand speech. No orchestrated photos, just a small box and a question and an answer that sounded like a promise that had taken its time. They married in autumn when the wind carried a clean edge and the light made everything honest. No chandeliers, no ledger of impressive guests, just a circle of people who knew the story and loved them through it. Eleanor wore a dark blue dress and held a bouquet that Clara insisted include rosemary for remembrance and thyme for courage. When Daniel and Clara said the words, they sounded plain. That was the beauty. Plain like bread, plain like water, the kind of plain that keeps you alive. After they ate lemon cake on paper plates and laughed when it leaned again in the center, someone started a small radio and an even smaller dance. As the sun dropped, the lighthouse woke and began its patient sweep. Daniel stood with his arm around Clara and his other around his mother. The beam moved across the water, and for the first time it felt less like warning and more like blessing. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment and let the cool evening press against her skin. The past had not disappeared. It never would. But it had found its shelf in a room that held more than sorrow. The market, the notebook, the nights of counting coins, all of it had led here to this ordinary holiness. Later, when the guests had gone and the paper plates had been stacked, Clara squeezed Eleanor's hands and said, "We will take care of him, and we will take care of you too, not as payment, as family." Eleanor smiled, the simple weight of those words settling where old worry used to live. Out beyond the bluff, the sea breathed its long breath. The lighthouse drew another careful line across the dark. And for the first time in a very long while, the future did not feel like a cliff. It felt like a path. Not straight, not smooth, but lit steadily by a light that did not tire. A new dawn does not need trumpets, only eyes willing to open. Eleanor opened hers and saw her son standing in the beam, not rescued, not ruined, but remade. She took his arm, and together they walked toward the glow of home. 2 years had passed since the whisper at the market. Time, Eleanor thought, had a way of layering over scars, not erasing them, but softening their edges until they became part of the skin itself. She sat now in her armchair by the window, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her, and listened to the evening sounds of the coastal town. The cries of gulls faded into the hush of waves, and somewhere far off the lighthouse began its nightly sweep. She had lived long enough to know that life rarely tied itself up in neat bows. It frayed it, tangled it, left threads hanging. Yet looking back, she could trace the line from that day in the market to the present and see clearly how one whispered warning had changed everything. Daniel was no longer the man bent under the weight of others' deceit. He was steadier, stronger, and more deliberate in his choices. His laughter came easily now, not strained, not forced. Clara had become not just his wife, but his anchor, an honest partner whose presence filled their home with a kind of peace Eleanor had once believed her son might never know again. Eleanor thought often of the past, but not with bitterness. The betrayal had carved something deep in both of them, but from that hollow space had grown a resilience neither had possessed before. Daniel had learned that generosity was still a gift, but one that required wisdom. Eleanor had learned that silence could be as dangerous as lies, that courage sometimes meant stepping into conflict rather than avoiding it. She remembered Victor's smug face, Celeste's brittle laughter, the ledger filled with careful lies. For a time, those memories had haunted her sharp as glass. Now they were lessons painful, yes, but also grounding. They had taught her that family is not defined by marriage contracts or polite words at dinner tables, but by the people who choose truth even when it hurts. It was Clara who said it best one evening, her hands busy with chopping herbs in the kitchen while Daniel poured wine. Deception builds fast like a fire, but truth is the water that puts it out. It may leave ashes, but it saves what matters. Eleanor carried those words with her, repeating them silently whenever doubt crept back. On this evening, she lifted her eyes from her cooling tea and watched the street below. Children were chasing one another with wooden sticks turned into swords. A man walked his dog slowly, stopping to greet a neighbor. Life ordinary and unremarkable went on, and yet she knew how quickly such ordinariness could be ripped away. That was why stories mattered, why truth mattered. She thought again of the vendor at the market, the man whose whisper had sparked it all. His face came to her vividly lined, weary, yet filled with a kind of urgent compassion. "Watch them closely," he had said. Those words had saved her son. Perhaps she thought sharing this story now might save someone else. Her voice in her mind shifted, taking on the cadence she would use to speak directly to others. "Some of you may be where I once was, trusting, believing, turning away from the small cracks in the stories you are told. Maybe you've convinced yourself that doubt is disloyalty, that silence is love. But silence, I learned, can wound as deeply as lies. And trust without wisdom can become a weapon used against you." She paused, letting the words form in her heart before imagining them spoken aloud as if to all who might hear. If you see the signs, patterns that don't match, words that twist too smoothly, needs that never seem to end, do not look away. Love is not blind obedience. Love is protection. Sometimes protection means asking hard questions. Sometimes it means walking into the storm so the people you love won't drown in it. It isn't easy. It will cost you peace in the short term. But the peace that comes from truth is worth infinitely more than the quiet born of denial. The lighthouse beam swept again across the darkening horizon, steady, unwavering. Eleanor sipped her tea, the bitterness of the cooled liquid reminding her of all the bitter truths she had once resisted swallowing. They had hurt, yes, but they had also healed. She thought of Daniel, of Clara, of the laughter that now filled their home. She thought of the child they hoped to welcome soon, a grandchild who would grow up in a house built not on manipulation but on honesty. That thought alone made the long nights of worry and the painful confrontations worth it. Eleanor set her cup down and folded her hands in her lap. She had told her son once that a mother's job was not only to love but to protect. Tonight she realized that protection had taken many forms: quiet endurance, sharp confrontation, and finally the bravery to face truths no one wanted spoken. She drew a deep breath, letting the salty air from the open window fill her lungs. Then she whispered aloud, her voice carried off by the wind. It was worth it. Her story was not one of easy victories or neat endings. It was a story of survival, of deception uncovered, of trust broken and rebuilt with care. Above all, it was a story of courage, the kind that does not roar but persists quietly until the masks fall away. And for anyone listening, Eleanor wanted them to take this with them, that truth is not the enemy of love. It is its foundation. Without it, everything crumbles. With it, even shattered lives can be pieced back together into something stronger than before. As the night deepened and the lighthouse swept once more across the waves, Eleanor felt the calm that comes when storms have passed and a new day waits to be born. If this story has touched you, If you believe in the power of truth to protect what matters most, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice might be the whisper someone else needs to hear.